Hey everyone, welcome to the video on budgetary supply policies. So these are policies that are contained within the budget but are designed to influence the level of aggregate supply in the economy. Alright, so it's really important when you're answering questions relating to these four types of policies that we go down the aggregate supply route of cost of production, ability and willingness, and productive capacity, and not the aggregate demand equation. Okay, it's really important when these phrases or types of policies come up in questions that you go down the supply side. So, the first one is spending on training and education. We're going to go through the four policy types differently, how they link to aggregate supply, and then how they link to each of the economic goals. And you're going to see a bit of a pattern or a trend here, which should make approaching these a bit easier. So let's start with training and education. Okay, so I've got the key knowledge point up here at the top, as you can see. And we're going to start with how it influences aggregate supply. So to start with, the definition of training and education is money provided by governments to improve the quality of human capital by enhancing the contribution that workers can make to production. Okay, making people better at working and stuff is kind of where this is going for. So let's start to split out to how it achieves aggregate supply. And as you guys remember, there's two ways that aggregate supply can actually change, and that's the ability to supply or the willingness to supply. And for most of these policy types, they can achieve either ability or willingness depending on how you answer that particular question. So we're going to start with ability, with training and education, how training and education improves the ability to supply. And that essentially is people learn new skills through training and education that create goods and services that were previously impossible, increasing productive capacity. So if the government were to spend money on training and education in scientific research or computer technology or something like that, due to the increased level of knowledge in those particular fields, then we can now create more stuff. Whenever we're creating more stuff, it's this phrase I really want you to use, this productive capacity. All right, that's the phrase that we're using to show an ability to supply has increased. When we look at productive capacity, the word capacity kind of means the total. Yeah, this glass has a capacity up till here, the very, very top. If the glass gets bigger, well, the total capacity or the amount of water that I can fit in this glass also increases. And it's the same for the economy. All right, when our productive capacity increases, we can make more stuff. And that's the ability to supply. And obviously when the ability to supply increases, we also see there an increase in aggregate supply. But we can get there from the other side as well. So we can get there from a willingness to supply. So when the government invests in training and education, the willingness to supply increases because there's more skilled workers now entering the workforce. And as you guys know, when supply of something increases, the price of it falls because there's essentially a surplus of that particular commodity. And it's the same in labour markets. So if we've got more trained and skilled people entering the workforce, there's more of them, they're less scarce, and then so that puts downward pressure on wages. That's a good thing for businesses because then that lowers the cost of production. And as you guys know, when cost of production falls, that's going to increase aggregate supply as well due to the willingness to supply. All right, so we've talked about here how it influences aggregate supply. Now we're going to go on to how training and education influences domestic macroeconomic goals. And I want you to focus here on these specific policies and how they achieve the goals. Okay, so theoretically, all aggregate supply policies achieve or don't achieve the goals in the same ways. And we cover that off in, I think it was the very first key knowledge point in the study designed for this outcome. Yeah, so it's linked to inflation, strong and sustainable economic growth, and full employment is already covered in all that material that we've already done. So then the new stuff to learn here purely is just music has come on. Sorry about that. Is purely how a specific policy is able to achieve or not achieve each of the three goals. So just like we did with budgetary policy, you've got to try and remember details about policies. And so here's one here for training and education. So the example I want you to use for this year is the $500 million job trainer program, and that's a skills investment program with a focus on retraining or reskilling those looking for jobs amid the coronavirus. And there's just some particular industries there that you can throw into your responses to show your assessor that you know something about this policy. You don't need to put them all in, but just a few will be fine. Okay, so let's now go through the goals. This is going to follow a very similar pattern to when we did it. I think it's KK61, but the one at the start of the outcome on how each of these achieve. But all we're doing differently is we're just adding in specific details about this particular policy. Okay, so here we've got how this policy achieves low inflation. Well, there's going to be an increase in the supply of labour in these areas that you can see here. Okay, that's going to put downward pressure on wages, just like we said before. So we're going down the willingness pathway here. That creates a fall in cost inflation because cost of production has fallen, which is actually going to move us further away from the goal in this instance because we're currently below the goal for inflation. So anything that reduces inflation is actually going to move us further away from the goal. And you're going to see a common trend in all of these four policies. We all move away from the goal. We then have strong and sustainable economic growth. So and we're kind of doing a launch point off at this point here, yeah, as cost of production or wages has fallen, the willingness to supply these particular industries has increased. There's a greater willingness to supply in these particular industries because there's more workers now, and so if I want to go and supply in that area, to staff those areas is cheaper for me now, so I can make more profit. So as a result, the aggregate supply increases, and then whenever we get an increase to aggregate supply, we can make the leap straight to an increase in GDP. And when GDP increases, that's great because we're moving closer to the goal. And then finally, the link to full employment. As always, to get to full employment, your launch point is here. Is here on GDP. So if we've said here, GDP increases, great. Then it's the same flow that you've been doing all year. When GDP increases, the derived demand for labour in these particular industries will increase. And so therefore we move closer to the full employment goal. The flow on inflation, strong and sustainable economic growth, and full employment here, you're going to see is very consistent across all of the policy types. So let's move on to research and development grants. So what are research and development grants? They are money, that is, money provided by governments to investigate and discover new products, improved ways of producing products, or more efficient means of distributing products. So let's go again, ability and willingness. So this improves the ability to supply, which again is all about productive capacity. You've got to use this phrase, yeah, if you're going to talk about ability. The discovery of new products and services, for example, vaccines, which is very pertinent at the moment, creates products that were not available before. Yeah, so the capacity of what we can make in an economy has actually increased. So therefore, productive capacity has increased, the ability to supply has increased, aggregate supply increases. On the other side, development of more efficient supply conditions, such as money spent to research the technology towards driverless trucks, will lower cost of production because then those trucking companies don't need to pay workers anymore. Machines are much cheaper in the long run and much more efficient. They can run 24 hours a day. And so the cost of production for those industries where there's been research and development spending will fall. Therefore, willingness to supply will increase. Aggregate supply increases. Okay, let's go for an example research and development policy. Here, the federal government is spending $66 million in 2020 on COVID-19 research. So this is different to the aggregate demand policies that we talked about earlier in the year. This is specifically an R&D spending. They're doing these four things. They're trying to invest in a vaccine. They're investing in antiviral therapies, so how we actually use then these therapies. They're investing in the trials of potential treatments. And they're improving the response to future pandemics so we can be better placed into the future. So you wouldn't need all of that for 2 marks if you were asked for it, but just to sprinkle a few of those elements in. The most important one is the dollar amount and a couple of these features here. Okay, so low inflation. Here we go. This is going to lower cost of production for vaccines because if, let's say, it's costing $100 million to create a vaccine and the government gives you $20 million, well, then your cost of production for that vaccine has fallen. You're not spending $100 million on this vaccine anymore. You're now spending $80 million on this vaccine. So when the cost of production falls, the producers are going to pass on those cost savings in the form of lower prices. All right. We then have a fall in cost inflation. So this is just going down the cost inflation pathway, which will move us again further away from the goal because we're currently below the goal. For strong and sustainable economic growth, if the government spends this money, it lowers the cost of production to produce vaccines. We're just going straight to willingness to supply here. And as willingness to supply increases, aggregate supply and GDP increases, which moves us closer to the goal. And then full employment, it's exactly the same as the last one, but instead of having specific industries in this area here, we've just said medical fields. All right, so you're just bringing in the specific nature of this policy and which labour markets it's actually going to affect. So you'll notice here, for both strong and sustainable economic growth and full employment, you need to kind of talk to either willingness or ability. Not so important here when you're going to the low inflation goal. You'll see we get lower cost of production here. Normally you would then push off to aggregate supply, but you don't necessarily need to do that in this place. You can just jump straight here. Whereas for strong and sustainable economic growth, you have to talk about willingness to supply to get to GDP. And in order to full employment, you have to talk about GDP. All right, so it's kind of like a flow pattern. I hope that kind of makes sense. All right, moving on. Investment in infrastructure. What is it? Money provided by governments for key physical and organisational structures within an economy. Ability and willingness. So again, both apply here. So it increases ability to supply through the creation of new methods to distribute goods. For example, if the government were to spend money putting a new regional airport, airport in a country area, that's going to create new business and new output that wasn't previously there. So there, the ability to supply increases, so therefore aggregate supply increases. On the willingness side, if infrastructure enables more faster distribution of goods and services, for example, freeways, this lowers cost of production because you don't need to spend as much money sending stuff around the country, and therefore willingness to supply increases, aggregate supply increases. The example infrastructure policy is the $10 billion job maker. So this is just $10 billion in future projects that were planned for like 5 and 10 years down the track that they've just brought forward. Okay, so we spend that money sooner. For example, the Snowy hydroelectric scheme or the Melbourne-Brisbane rail link. Your link to all three of these is exactly the same as it has been, and I want you to kind of get that through in that you're not learning new systems or processes to link any of these four through to any of the goals. Okay, it's all the same. All you're doing is you're just putting in a little bit of information for this specific policy. So here it's lowest cost of production to transport goods. Because it's quicker to get things, around the country through the Melbourne-Brisbane rail link. It lowers cost of production to transport goods, and it derived demand for labour in nation-building industries increases. All right, so that's only difference between all three of these. And then we get to our final one, which is a provision of subsidies. And what is a subsidy? Well, that's money provided by governments to help consumers, industry, or a business keep the price of a good or service low. This is the weird one in it only does willingness, okay? So I only want you to talk about willingness when we're talking about subsidies, okay? How does it do that? Well, the provision of money at lowest cost of production, that's pretty straightforward, increasing willingness to supply. There's common ideas here between subsidies and, say, R&D grants, because a research and development grant is kind of similar to a subsidy, so it's a similar way to think about it. Your example subsidy policy I want you to talk about here is the $7.5 billion per year fuel tax credit scheme. And essentially, big businesses who use a lot of fuel can claim back the tax from the fuel that they spend money on. And the government spends roughly $6.5 billion a year on this, okay, just to lower the cost of production when it comes to how much fuel that they use. So mining companies, for example, use a lot of fuel, and so they get a lot of benefit from this. Again, the flow here is exactly the same. Lowest cost of production is your launching point here. Lowest cost of production is your launching point here, and GDP is your launch point here. So to summarize, what you need to know for each type is you need to know the definition of the type of policy, number one. Number two, how this policy in general affects aggregate supply, and that's through the ability and willingness split that I did on that first slide for each policy type. And then for the specific policies, you need to know 2 sentences worth of stuff for the example, and then specifically for that example, how it affects the achievement of all 3 goals. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. Any questions, please reach out. But otherwise, thanks for sticking through what looks to be a nearly 15-minute video. So thanks again. Happy learning.